From Bloomberg World Headquarters in New York to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, I'm David Weston. Welcome to Balance of Power, where the world of politics meets the world of business. We're just 18 hours away from polls opening on the East Coast of the United States, and already over 95 million Americans have cast their vote, either early in person or by mail. To bring us up to speed on this Election Day Eve, we turn to our chief Washington correspondent, Kevin Cirilli. It's not just Election Day Eve, it's your birthday, as I understand it, Kevin. So happy birthday. But give us a sense of what these candidates are doing today. One day to go.
Well, thank you. It's a marathon, not a sprint. But today it is a sprint up until when the first polls open tomorrow on Election Day. Democratic presidential nominee Joe Biden spending his time, David, in the Keystone State, Pennsylvania, where his campaign is headquartered. He's also going to be making a last-ditch effort to try to turn Ohio, get this, Ohio back to blue. This, of course, had been trending, a state that had been trending Republican for quite some time, and Democrats now feel that they might have Ohio in play. President Trump barnstorming across the country. North Carolina, a key state, a key Senate race, mind you. Also going to be making stops in Florida, in Pennsylvania, Iowa, where he's trying to give a lift to Senator Joni Ernst, an incumbent Republican in the Senate. So all of this comes at a time in which there are now new reports about how both of the candidates will be spending their election night. I spoke with a source close to the president's re-election campaign earlier this morning, David, who told me that the president will be having a very close circle of prominent, notable names surrounding him on election night at the White House, where he likely could give some type of national address. Whether or not he declares victory, whether or not Joe Biden declares victory, we don't know. But the president suggesting that he is preparing his team for there to be not just a long night ahead of them, but a long several days after the election. David?
Yeah, we're talking about election week, aren't we, Kevin? Thank you so much. Look forward to spending that week with you, Kevin Cirilli, our chief Washington correspondent. With us throughout the election coverage this year has been our Bloomberg political contributor, Jeannie Zaino. She's professor of political science at Iona College. She's back with us now. Jeannie, great to have you with us. So a day before, give us a sense of what you're looking at. Set the stage.
Well, I'm exhausted hearing Kevin just talk about what the candidates are doing, because it is quite a marathon. And, the president in particular, just after COVID, to be doing this many big rallies outside, it's quite incredible. But I think, what I'm looking for as we move into election night, number one, is to see, does Joe Biden break into any of those Sunbelt states? I think if he does, particularly those states that count early, like a Florida, like a Georgia, like a North Carolina, I'm not expecting he will, but if he does, I think that would bode problematic for the president. But if the president is able to hold those, as he was in 2016, this then moves into the Midwestern states. So we're particularly looking, obviously, at Pennsylvania, and they, of course, are not going to be releasing results, we expect, on election night. So to your point, we could then be looking at a few days, if not more, before we know the results of this.
Yeah, a terribly important point. We're all going to have to be patient, I think, tomorrow night, without a doubt. Jeannie, this is an election like no other, with given the number of people who voted early, voting by absentee ballot. Another difference, though, I wonder, is how stubborn the polls have been. There's been that margin of Vice President Biden over President Trump pretty stubbornly throughout. If, in fact, because of the energy, as you describe it, President Trump is bringing to this, and the barnstorming, if it turns around, what does that mean for polling in this country?
It's such a good question. We sort of, pollsters had egg on their face in 2016. I'm not so sure it was warranted, but with all the predictions that Clinton would win by 80, 90%, and then for her to lose, that was problematic. Of course, if it happens again, I think we as an industry are really going to have to go back and see where we are going wrong. I think the important thing to keep in mind, and Ann was just on talking about it, these polls are all within a margin of error. So if we're looking at something like Pennsylvania at 4 or 5% for Biden, in a margin of error of 3 or 4%, that means it's pretty much neck and neck. So I think we have to keep that in mind. In these states that are tight, we could see the president pull it out, as he did in 2016.
And I want to come back to the question of how long we have to wait, because as we've discussed before, depending on the state, you could have early returns coming in favoring President Trump and then turning around, or vice versa. For example, between Pennsylvania and Florida, it's very different in when those absentee ballots get counted.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's on a state by state basis in terms of when they start counting and how long they're accepting ballots. So, I think this was some of the concern people had over the weekend listening to the president say he might declare victory on election night if it's close before all of the ballots are counted. And I think what we'd be looking at in that case would be a whole lot of litigation on both sides. And of course, that's almost a worst case scenario, not just for people watching this election closely like we are, but for Americans as a whole, because it raises all kinds of questions of social unrest, potentially rioting and violence and those kinds of things. So that would be an almost worst case scenario, sort of a 2000 on speed where we'd had that across several states potentially.
It's not just the president that we're electing, but also a third of the Senate. And there's a real question whether the Senate could switch back to Democrat or not. How realistic is that, do you think, right now?
10 months ago, 11 months ago, we would have said not really likely. But at this point, it is absolutely possible Democrats take the Senate. And I think it's so important to watch that and to talk about it. The Democrats only need to pick up 3 seats if Biden wins. They need to pick up 4 if he loses, and they will control the Senate. And there's a lot of close races out there, Republicans defending many more seats than Democrats are. And so Democrats really have a shot to take this. So, we're watching states from Maine, for instance, with Susan Collins, where the spending and ad spending, we understand, has been $26 million in ad spending alone, which is quite incredible. And, you're looking at big spending across the country on these Senate races because it's a really important prospect of Democrats taking the Senate at this point.
And Jeannie, if we didn't have enough troubles, we may not know the result, as I understand, the Senate either. This is something you spotted, actually. We have, of course, 2 Senate races in Georgia because there's one special election, and they have to get more than 50% to get elected. You could have runoffs in 1 or even 2 Senate seats in Georgia alone.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have Loeffler and Purdue. Both of those seats are up. And if if in either race they don't get over 50, as you mentioned, it goes to a runoff. And we could potentially not know who controls the Senate until January, in which case we're going to see a lot of money pour into Georgia to continue funding these campaigns. I think we're all hoping it doesn't happen in both. But at this point, looking at the polls, it's a real possibility down there. And of course, in Maine, you have the ranked choice voting, and that can also put a wrinkle in terms of how that comes out for Susan Collins, the incumbent there.
Yeah, a lot of possibilities to prepare for. Thank you so much to Jeannie Zaino, Iona College professor and Bloomberg contributor. She'll be with us tomorrow night for that election coverage. And now let's get a check on the markets. Joining us now is Abigail Doolittle. So when I looked a little earlier, it looked like people were buying pretty much everything, Abigail.
Yeah, real risk on day here, at least relative to stocks. Commodities a little bit less so, but we have big gains for both the Dow and the S&P 500. The NASDAQ less so. I'm not sure that has so much to do with the election. Last Friday, there were some saying that perhaps last Friday could turn out to be the pre-election low, similar to 2016 when you had the 2 weeks into the election down weeks, and then you had a big rally in the election week and out of the election. What's very clear, though, is we have lots of selling in the tech space. That probably has to do with JP Morgan saying that they're lightening up on their overweighting tech positioning to a neutral. They expect some of the more cyclical sectors to take hold, and that has nothing to do with the election. They think that will happen no matter who wins the presidency. What they do say, though, is, and this is not surprising, that what investors really want relative to the election is certainty, that they want to know who is going to win this election, and that once that's in place, that's going to be a real positive for the markets. And one sign of that uncertainty that you and Jeannie and Kevin were just talking about, bonds. We actually have bonds rallying in a big way on the day after selling off last week. Never a dull moment, David.
Yeah, Abigail, it isn't. But one thing you follow, I know, is positioning. Is that telling us anything? Are people hedging? What's going on with the VIX?
The VIX is actually down just slightly today, but the VIX continues to suggest that, yes, investors are hedging into the election. The VIX has been outpacing the VXN, or the tech index VIX, which is pretty interesting because it, again, suggests that relative to regular volatility, as opposed to that mega cap volatility, investors are starting to bring up the hedge in terms of anything can happen. And something else that I've been watching over the last few months, the S&P 500 stuck in this huge range of congestion. And there's one line of thinking that says that if in the 3 months ahead of the election, the stock market is up, that supports the incumbent. If it is down, that supports the contender. David, right now it's on the wire, suggesting that the markets are far more uncertain about the outcome of this election than the polls are.
Yeah, exactly. The polls may not be reliable. We'll find out soon enough. Thank you so much, Abigail. That's Abigail Doolittle reporting on the markets. Coming up, we're going to talk with the former political director for the California Republican Party, Mike Madrid, about the key question of the Latino vote. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and radio. I'm David Weston. We turn now to Mark Crumpton for Bloomberg First Word News.
David, thank you. The Justice Department plans to send monitors to voting locations in 13 states tomorrow to make sure federal voting rights laws are enforced. They include 6 counties in the battleground state of Florida and 3 in the battleground state of Pennsylvania. Officials say the monitors will make sure voters can cast their ballots without discrimination, intimidation, or harassment. President Trump will spend election night at the White House. The president's campaign had planned a traditional party at his Washington, D.C. hotel. But the president said last week he was considering other options because of the District of Columbia's coronavirus protocols. They would restrict the size of the gathering. His press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, told Fox News today that the president will monitor the election results from the White House. The head of the World Health Organization has gone into self-quarantine. Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus says he is isolating himself after coming into contact with someone who tested positive for COVID-19. Dr. Tedros says he is well, has no symptoms, and will work from home for the coming days. On Sunday, Geneva, where the WHO is based, imposed a partial confinement until late November amid a surge in cases. Former National Security Agency whistleblower Edward Snowden is applying for Russian citizenship. Snowden and his wife are expecting a baby. He cited the child as motivation to become a dual U.S.-Russian citizen. Russian President Vladimir Putin granted Snowden asylum in 2013 after he revealed highly classified NSA surveillance programs. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg. David?
Thanks so much, Mark. The Latino vote could play an important role in the presidential contest tomorrow as Latinos grow as a proportion of the overall population, even as voter turnout with Latinos sometimes lags behind. Welcome now an expert on this subject. He is Mike Madrid. He was Director of Policy at the California State Republican Party. He went on to co-found the Lincoln Project and is a principal at Grassroots, a political consulting and lobbying firm in California. So, Mike, thanks so much for being back with us. Address the question of the Latino vote. How important is it? Is there there's a perception, at least, that Latinos don't turn out as much to vote? Is that accurate?
It actually is accurate, but the size and segment of the Latino share of our population and of the electorate has gotten so big now that even with lower voter turnout rates, Latinos will surpass African American voters this year as the second largest racial and ethnic voting group in the country. So it's a very critical constituency. Its sheer size is now a force to be reckoned with in an electoral sense. And while there has historically been lower voter turnout than other groups, we will see a historic turnout of Latinos in November 3rd, just a couple short days away.
We refer to the Latino vote, but as a practical matter, it's not a monolith, right?
That's absolutely right. And again, as it gets bigger, we start to learn more and more about the complexities. Cuban Americans, of course, are changing the dynamics in Florida. The southwestern United States is overwhelmingly Mexican American. There's a lot of identified Puerto Ricans, of course, who are already American citizens throughout the eastern seaboard, from New York down to Florida. Central Americans are a huge part of the Floridian electorate, and we are seeing Mexican American populations grow in places like Pennsylvania, North Carolina, even Iowa.
So we've been talking about the swing states or battleground states here that include some of those you just mentioned, such as Florida, such as Pennsylvania, and for that matter, Arizona as well. Where could the Latino vote and showing up or not showing up make a significant difference in the presidential?
It's a great question. Arizona, certainly. Texas, of course, is a battleground state and is a battleground state in large parts to the rise of the Latino electorate. Florida, of course, with its complex Hispanic community, because it is so diverse. Pennsylvania, there's a good pocket of about 100,000 Hispanic voters, which could be decisive. North Carolina and Iowa. Really, we're hitting a point in American history where this will probably be the last election where Hispanics will not be central to most of the battleground states as we determine the next president of the United States.
So give us a sense between President Donald Trump and the former Vice President Joe Biden. For whom is the Latino more important? And let me be very specific on something. There was a report on Bloomberg just last Friday that perhaps some people in the Biden camp were concerned about voter turnout among Hispanics, particularly in South Florida.
That's a great question. And the answer, unfortunately, is it's critical for both of them for different reasons. It's absolutely central to Donald Trump's ability to take Florida. He's invested massively in Miami-Dade and South Florida in trying to get and consolidate as much of this Cuban vote as he possibly can. Cubans make up about 6% of the Floridian electorate. About half of those are breaking for Biden. Half of those are breaking for Trump. Those are good numbers for Donald Trump. Biden's going to have to do a little bit better, as the Bloomberg News article reported. Now you switch over to Texas. It's really about turnout. And if they do get the turnout, they meaning the Biden campaign, I do expect there's a very good possibility that Texas could actually flip to the Democrats' column. I think the Hispanic vote in Arizona will actually be decisive for Biden.
What are the things, if you can summarize in general, what are the things that typically drive a Latino to turn out and vote? What do they care about the most?
Well, this is a fascinating question and a really good one. For 30 years, Hispanics have been telling us that jobs and the economy are the number one issue, followed closely by education and healthcare. The reason why I say it's a good question is because more often than not, we stereotypically look at issues like immigration, driver's licenses for the undocumented, or building a border wall, or having kids in cages being the driving issues. While those are, of course, extremely important to the community, they should be important to absolutely everybody. And one of the reasons why we do see lower turnout is because neither major party is addressing the economic concerns of the fastest growing segment of the American population. And until that's reconciled, we probably will not see higher turnout levels. And whichever party is able to capture the economic agenda, an aspirational middle class agenda for Latinos, will probably be the majority party for the next decade.
Mike, we have a different issue, different from the last 100 years in the pandemic this time. We've had a number of reports about how it has disproportionately hit the Latino community and the African-American community, by the way, Native Americans as well. Is that a motivation for Latinos? Are they focused on COVID-19 particularly?
That's a really good question. The answer is yes, they are, not only because of the health and safety and the disproportionate impact. Again, Latinos are 3 times more likely to be infected, largely because Latinos make up the essential workforce that keeps the economy running in times of pandemic and allows other people to quarantine, but also because death rates have not only gone up and skyrocketed in the community, but the economic destruction. Those the most economically devastated by this pandemic are people of color generally, and Latinos specifically. So I do believe that this will be a driving issue. Most polling suggests that it is. The one big variable is what's that going to mean on election day? Latinos are notoriously late to deciding as a part of the electorate, and they are overwhelmingly election day voters. I expect we will see very, very large numbers from Hispanics showing up on Tuesday to vote alongside Republicans, kind of an odd marriage. But those people standing in long lines tomorrow will be rural white Republicans and Latino Democrats.
Fascinating. Mike, that was really informative. Really appreciate you being with us. That's Mike Madrid. He's co-founder of the Lincoln Project. And be sure to tune in for our coverage of the election results. That will start tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Bloomberg. The time has come to elect the next president of the United States, and the stakes could not be higher. 2 candidates, 2 very different paths for the future of the country. I'm David Weston. We will bring you the results as they unfold live on election night. Join us Tuesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. Eastern Time on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. It's time now for a check of the markets. Polls are still favoring a change in the White House, but what are the markets telling us? Scarlett Fu has some numbers on what we should expect. Scarlett, what are they telling us?
Well, David, the conventional wisdom is that a good stock market favors the guy who's already in office. And history shows that when the stock market is up in the 3 months prior to Election Day, the incumbent gets reelected. When the market is down, the incumbent loses. And that has been the case in 20 of the past 23 presidential elections, which goes all the way back to 1928. Of course, 2020, that's all I need to say. Nothing is clear cut in 2020. And this year, we have the market little changed, up marginally. It was up just 0.1% when I checked earlier. That means a gain or a loss will come down to the wire. The S&P 500 has kind of been all over the place, as you can see there, since the summer, but it really has settled into a narrow range over the last week or so. Now, we have seen low tax companies outperform high tax peers over the past month. Polls show Joe Biden leading over Donald Trump. Charles Myers, who is the chairman of Signum Global Advisors, the former vice chairman of Evercore ISI, told Bloomberg TV this morning that taxes are the most underpriced risk in U.S. equity markets. And that's because markets have priced in this narrative that the weak economy will force Joe Biden to water down his tax plan if he's reelected. What is not understood, according to Charles Myers, is that the magnitude of how much personal and corporate taxes will go up and be made retroactive to the start of 2021 is a much more likely scenario. And of course, that's something that we'll have to grapple with. But you can see in the meantime, companies with low taxes have outperformed.
So, Scarlett, you and I think almost every day get some bank or the other predicting what stocks will do well or poorly, depending on whether Joe Biden gets elected or President Donald Trump. So are people basically pricing in whatever might happen come January 20?
Yeah, that's been the case for the last couple of months. And a big part of that idea is that the long-awaited rotation into value stocks, cyclical stocks, will take place, will really take hold. And we've already seen that begun, at least judging by fund flows. You can see the green at the end of the chart there. That shows that value funds have seen 13 weeks of inflows. And the thinking is that a Biden victory, along with perhaps winning the Senate, would mean an easier path to fiscal stimulus and infrastructure spending. Now, Charles Myers, who I mentioned earlier, said that the stimulus and infrastructure spending plans would offset the expected tax increases.
Yeah, I wonder, though, if they're fully prepared for those tax increases. That's the question. And also the question is how much time, really, it's going to take to get that stimulus through and how big it will be, for that matter.
Yeah.
But it's also affected the value of the dollar, as I understand it.
It's affected the value of the dollar, but there are a lot of other question marks as well in terms of how the other countries are managing their economic policy, their stimulus, and, of course, their monetary policy as well. Don't forget, after the election, we have a lot of other big events that investors need to brace for, whether it's the FOMC decision due out on Thursday or the October jobs report, which comes out on Friday.
Yeah, it's quite a week, no doubt about it. Thank you so much to Scarlett Fu for that report on the markets and what they're telling us about the election. Up next, the legal wrangling is in full swing on the eve of the election. We talk with election law expert Professor Richard Briffault of Columbia Law School. He's going to talk about what's going on in Pennsylvania and in South Carolina, and for that matter, in Texas. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, federal and state officials have erected barriers to thwart cyber attacks before tomorrow's election. Hundreds of people will be linked to the Homeland Security Department's command center. They include experts from the Pentagon, National Security Agency, and companies such as Twitter and Facebook. New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio says he's concerned about the number of COVID cases and percentage of positive test results, but that the hospital situation in the city remains under control. Mayor de Blasio says the 7-day average remains under 2%. A positive rate of 3% citywide would trigger a shutdown of the school system. Italy is taking new steps to try to stem the spread of COVID-19. The measures include closing shopping malls on the weekends, shuttering museums, and limiting movements between regions. Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte also says he will enforce a nighttime curfew. Conte told lawmakers the restrictions will vary by region depending on how severe the outbreak is in each area. The Vatican is breaking its silence on Pope Francis's controversial comments on gay civil unions. The Vatican says the remarks were taken out of context in a documentary that spliced together parts of an old interview. But the Vatican does confirm that Francis believes that same-sex couples should have legal protections. While the pontiff was known to have taken that position privately, he had never articulated his support as Pope. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in over 120 countries. I'm Mark Crumpton. This is Bloomberg.
Thanks very much, Mark. President Trump has said he will fight court decisions that at this point allow Pennsylvania and North Carolina to count absentee ballots received after but postmarked before November 3rd. Welcome now a leading expert on election law. He is Richard Perfault. He's professor of law at Columbia University. So, Professor, always great to have you with us. Give us a sense of what's going on in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina and what his legal challenge, the president's legal challenge, could be.
Okay. Thank you. It's good to be here. So in both of those states, state decision makers, in Pennsylvania it was the state Supreme Court with the agreement of the Secretary of State of the state, the chief elections officer, and in North Carolina, it was the North Carolina Board of Elections, again, working in a consent decree with the state court. They agreed to extend the deadline for the receipt of absentee ballots, so the ballots could come in after Election Day, several days after Election Day, provided they were postmarked before, relying on the kind of the double whammy of the COVID pandemic, which has led to huge numbers of requests for absentee ballots and people sending them in, and the delays that the U.S. Postal Service has acknowledged is affecting postal service, so that it's taking longer for absentee ballots to be mailed to voters and longer for the absentee ballots that the voters are sending back to actually get to the elections offices. So in both states, the result of litigation, they agree we're going to give voters more time to get their ballots and not past Election Day to mail them, but to get them in a few days later. And that's what's been challenged. There was efforts before, in the recent weeks, to stop those rulings outright. In both cases, the Supreme Court declined to stop those rulings. But there are hints, at least there were some dissents in the Supreme Court case in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina as well, that the issue might come back after Election Day. What the court declined to do was issue an injunction stopping those ballots, but they might look at them afterwards. And indeed, I know in Pennsylvania, the Attorney General and the Secretary of State have said they're going to keep those ballots in effect, a separate pile in case there's a challenge to them afterwards.
So, Professor, at the very beginning of what you said state authorities, the courts in the case of Pennsylvania, election authorities in the case of North Carolina. Is that a critical distinction? Because we also had an attempt in Wisconsin that came up through the federal courts, as I understand it, and it went the other way. Is it possible that's what the Supreme Court is looking at, whether it's the state officials deciding it or a federal court?
That's been a big issue, a big distinction. That's an important. You raise a very important distinction that we've had. So the Supreme Court has pretty consistently slapped down efforts on the part of lower federal courts to liberalize the conditions for voting in light of the pandemic, saying that violates a doctrine the Supreme Court laid out a couple of years ago called the Purcell Principle, that says that federal courts should not be intervening to set aside election rules or to modify election rules in the pre-election period. The court, that's part of the court's kind of management of the lower federal courts. That doesn't apply when a state court or a state decision maker makes a change like that. There's still some room for Supreme Court action, but it wouldn't be out of their supervisory authority over lower courts. It would actually be more on the merits, more on the idea that there's something about this action, that there might be something about this action that violates something in the Constitution.
So, Professor, let's travel all the way down to Texas, because over the weekend we had a dispute arise in Texas, and I understand it's in Houston, Harris County, the possibility of going through for drive-in voting. There's, I think, like 125,000 ballots have been cast or something. The state courts declined to stop that, although reportedly the Republicans are now going to go into federal court. What's going on down there?
It's, again, a claim is being made. I'm not even sure how good a claim it is that the county clerk in Harris County, is Houston, the biggest county in Texas, and the county clerk actually runs the actual mechanics of voting, has basically authorized curbside voting. People can drive up, kind of drive through, it sounds like it's like a tent or something, and there's election officials there, and one at a time to sort of receive the ballot so that people don't have to go into the polling place. Again, it's a kind of it's an accommodation to COVID. And that's been challenged. The claim is that the Harris County clerk has gone beyond his authority. So far, the state courts have not agreed with that. The state courts have not stepped in to stop this. And as you point out, I think well over 100,000 ballots have been cast this way. The plaintiffs in this case, who I think are Republican voters, are challenging it, again, on some notion that it's beyond the clerk's authority and somehow violates the election rules. And we'll find out whether I think the hearing in Texas is supposed to be today. It might even be going on right now. How the federal court judge will rule, and what in particular will happen to the 120,000 or so people who cast their ballots in good faith, relying on the declaration, relying on the system set up by the Harris County clerk.
Professor, you and I have talked in the past about what appear to be a record number of lawsuits involving this election already have been filed, many of which have been resolved at this point. We're running out of time. As a practical matter, are we about to pivot from what happened before the votes were cast to recounts, things like that?
Yeah, although some of it will relate, because like these issues about the Dropbox the curbside voting, there's some issues about Dropbox voting, and some issues about the absentee ballots that arrive after Election Day in states that normally don't allow it. Many states do allow it, and those states aren't being challenged. And the point is, what we're getting is a lot of things where the rules have been revised in light of COVID in a number of states. And I think there may be still challenges. These challenges now are to sort of stop those changes before Election Day. It's conceivable, certainly in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, that there'll be continued claims that those ballots shouldn't be counted, even though they've been received. Once they've been received in Pennsylvania, they've actually going to be set aside, I think, awaiting a challenge. At least that means that the ballots that come in on time won't be challenged. So,
Professor, because you are a student of election law, clarify one thing for me. We remember Bush versus Gore, in which the Supreme Court really did decide the presidency. How relatively rare is it for courts actually decide elections as opposed to the voters and the election officials?
Well, I think Bush versus Gore, Florida, 2000 was 20 years ago, and that's the last major time this happened. I think, and occasionally you'll see it for other elections, state legislative elections, other elections. There will be claims of like irregularities, claims of misconduct, and they will go through the ordinary, litigation process. So it has happened that courts have had to make decisions. I think there was a Senate race in Minnesota in 2008. It's rare that they're dispositive, but it matters when the election is close, because then a few thousand ballots one way or the other could swing the result. Remember, in Florida, the number of ballots, the ultimate margin, I think, was under 1,000 votes when 6 million votes were cast.
Exactly right. Thank you so much. It really is always a treat to have you on this subject of election law. That's Professor Richard Fault of Columbia Law School. Coming up, President Trump making a final campaign pitch to a crucial voter bloc, African-American men. Will those outreach efforts pay off? We're going to talk with the co-chair of Black Voices for Trump, T.W. Shannon, who is with the Trump campaign in Pennsylvania. That's coming up next. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. President Trump's schedule today includes events in North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, maybe a few others. For a report on the Trump campaign, we welcome now Bloomberg White House correspondent Josh Wingrove. So, Josh, give us a sense of what it's like inside the campaign right now. What are they thinking? How are they feeling?
Well, they're making that last push, and essentially they think in 2016 everyone wrote them off, and the same thing is happening now. They're confident, in particular, in the Sun Belt. They're looking at Arizona. Some folks in the campaign even think they'll flip Nevada. The president has spent a lot of time, more than any other state, in Pennsylvania. It looks like they think that will sort of be the state that it comes down to. And so we'll see him there today. We see Joe Biden there today as well. But again, anyone in the president's orbit will tell you that they didn't get too worked up about polls in 2016, and they're not going to try to get too worked up about them now. But certainly the public polls that are out there show that the president is an underdog or a long shot tomorrow. He needs what he calls a big red wave of turnout to deliver victory in the states that will get him over 270 tomorrow. Yeah,
Josh, I got to say, the polls are against him maybe, but boy, you can't question his enthusiasm, his energy on that campaign trail.
Yeah, I mean, he's, I think 14 rallies over today and the previous 2 days. He believes that these rallies can turn the tide, that they're, big for voter identification, that sort of thing. On the flip side, Democrats don't really object to the rallies, and pollsters say it's not clear that they have the punch they once did. The Trump campaign emphatically disputes that. So I guess, we'll see. But President Trump wants to put his feet on the ground in these swing states today. He woke up in Florida, North Carolina doing a rally, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, really trying to hit those states that really clinched this thing for him 4 years ago, and he would hope to have a repeat showing at today. But as I say, Michigan, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, the public polls at least are indicating that that Biden has a lead in those states. So Trump needs to hope that those polls get proven wrong.
Okay, Josh, thank you so much for being with us. That's Bloomberg White House reporter Josh Wingrove. Now for a view on the election from someone who has been a staunch supporter of the president. Welcome now T.W. Shannon. He's president and CEO of Chickasaw Community Bank. He's also co-chair of Black Voices for Trump. Mr. Shannon earlier served as the Speaker of the Oklahoma House of Representatives. So, Mr. Shannon, thank you so much for being with us. First, start with where you are. I understand you're in Pennsylvania, but you're on a bus. Is that correct?
I have, David. We've been all over the state of Pennsylvania. I got to tell you, the energy and the enthusiasm is incredible. It's off the charts. I mean, we've got people from all walks of life who are coming to the bus tour. I'm on the bus actually with Dr. Carson, Secretary Carson, and also other great Americans who are out there wanting to serve this president and wanting to see him elected for 4 years, including former Texas Governor and Secretary of Energy Rick Perry. So it's a great time.
So as you say, a lot of enthusiasm. We can see that in the rallies. We see it in the president himself. At the same time, the polls have been pretty stubborn, including one from Monmouth just out today saying there's a 7-point advantage for Vice President Biden. You think those polls are all just plain wrong?
Well, I got to tell you, the polls were wrong in 2016, and they're wrong in 2020. In fact, I got to tell you what has stood out to me more than anything. This campaign, it's not about Democrat or Republican or conservatives or liberals. This campaign is really about right and wrong. I mean, forgotten Americans. That's who's showing up at the president's rallies. That's who's showing up at the bus tour. I mean, you wouldn't believe the number of purple-haired, generational X's and Y's who are saying, listen, because of the Democrat shutdowns, I didn't have a job. I wasn't able to support my family. And this idea of having elected officials determine if you're essential or non-essential, that's just ridiculous. I mean, what we know is the shutdowns haven't worked. The first 100 days of a Biden presidency would mean a nationwide shutdown. We all know that, just like what's happening over in England. And Americans don't want that. We want our freedom. We want President Trump for 4 more years. We want to see this country, and they want to see their state of Pennsylvania prosper. That's what this election's about.
So TW, you said it's Democratic shutdowns. There were Republicans that shut down some states as well. But let's be honest, they shut it down because of coronavirus as a practical matter. And that coronavirus has disproportionately affected African Americans across the country. It's a higher infection rate and a higher mortality rate. Does President Trump bear any responsibility for that?
Well, I tell you, no. The person that's responsible for the Wuhan virus are the Chinese, and I think it's disgraceful to try to lay that at the president's feet. Listen, we're facing a pandemic. The president is bringing us out of that. But what we know is when we see shutdowns, the states that have shut down versus the states that haven't or that have reopened, the numbers really aren't that very much different. So we know that we can live with coronavirus until there is a cure. But this idea of going into your home and isolating from every individual, that's just not good science. It's not what the health experts are advising us to do. Certainly, we need to follow CDC guidelines, but Americans have got to work. We can't sit at home and wait for Nancy Pelosi to send us a check. I mean, that's just not the way that this economy is going to move. We've got to be safe. We've got to take precautions, but Americans have got to be working. And that's why President Trump has said, open the schools and open the economy so that Americans can get to work. And in Pennsylvania, that's what the people want. This is a working class state. People here like to work. People need to work. We don't need a nationwide shutdown. What we need is an economy that's working and a president that's leading. And that's what Donald Trump's doing.
No question we need an economy working. At the same time, even as people go to the polls tomorrow, the incidents of coronavirus are back on the uptick. We're going to push toward new records here. Is that the approach of the president basically just get over it?
Absolutely not. The president has done more to fight the coronavirus than I think can imagine. Even Dr. Fauci has said it. But the reality is this: a little over 200,000 Americans have died from corona. But let's put it in context: 400,000 people have died from high blood pressure. 600,000 Americans have died from heart disease. Shutdowns don't work. What we need is people who are willing to work with the president to find a cure, which we know that the president has done more to commit resources there, and we're going to have a cure very shortly. But until we do, we've got to learn how to work with the disease. But really, what I'm hearing people talk about here in Pennsylvania, people that are showing up, the thousands of people that are showing up to the president's rallies, and they're showing up for the Trump bus tour, they're not talking about the coronavirus. They're talking about freedom, because they know freedom is on the ballot. This socialist agenda that's being pushed by Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, that's not what Americans want. We don't want to be Venezuela. We don't want to be Europe. We're Americans. We're America. That's who we want to be, and that's who we're going to continue to be.
So, TW, let me come back to Pennsylvania specifically. Yeah. Where are you going in Pennsylvania? Because we've talked to various people about the difference between Philadelphia on the one hand and the west out by Pittsburgh, or the north up in Erie. I mean, what are you focused on particularly as opportunities for President Trump?
David, we're in oil country. I got to tell you, I'd be lying to you if I told you I've looked at the complete agenda, but we've been all over. We were in Ohio for a couple of days. We're in Pennsylvania, but we're in the heart of fracking country. And, you know, when Joe Biden, you know, told the American people on that stage that he was willing to sacrifice national security by ending fracking in the United States, I think that spoke volumes, and it spoke to Pennsylvanians. In fact, you can probably hear in the background now, I hear the people cheering. They're excited about this president because he knows that the greater the freedom, the greater the wealth. And that's what Pennsylvanians believe in. So we're all over the state. We're in the heart of fracking country. Yeah. And let me tell you, this state believes in energy independence just like Donald Trump does.
Yeah, fair enough. It's great to have you, TB. And I know that you were a stickler for accuracy as much as anybody. What Vice President Biden has said is ending fracking on public lands. He didn't say across the board. In fact, he denied that. But I take the point. It's important to Pennsylvania.
He said it multiple times, David, on other events that he wants to phase out fossil fuels. So
that is true. That is true. He said that. You and I agree on that. TW, it is really a treat to have you on always. Really appreciate it. And good luck in Pennsylvania. That's TW Shannon. He's former Oklahoma Speaker of the House and co-chair of Black Voices for Trump. And a quick programming note now. Make sure to tune into Bloomberg Television and Radio for our election night coverage starting at 7 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. Coming up, the view from the Biden campaign. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. Now, we've heard from the Trump campaign. It's time for the view from the Biden campaign. And so we welcome now our reporter on that campaign. She is Emily Wilkins. So great to have you. Give us your sense of where the Biden campaign is today, physically, I guess, but also emotionally.
Thanks so much, David. The Biden campaign physically is in Ohio and is absolutely in Pennsylvania. They are, quote unquote, barnstorming Pennsylvania today. Biden is there. Harris is there. Jill Biden is there. They're trying to go to all four corners of the state and get out Biden's final message that Americans are to heal the nation, to unify everyone. Trump needs to go. A line that we've heard a lot from the campaign is that they need to be done with, quote, the chaos, the tweets, the anger, the hate. The Biden campaign is also putting a high emphasis right now on making sure that Black voters turn out to the polls. As of last week, 75% of Black registered voters in Pennsylvania had not turned out to vote. And so Biden is really trying to make sure to target those voters through campaigns, through stops, and focusing on a message of unity.
So, Emily, as you know so well, the former vice president has had a stubborn advantage in the polls, really going back to the conventions and before. It's really hung in there throughout. Is there any concern within the Biden campaign right now that it might be slipping away? There are some reports maybe President Trump's gaining on him in some key states.
I think a lot of people are thinking back to 2016 and the sense going into Election Day that Hillary Clinton had all of these states locked up, that she was ahead in the polls in Pennsylvania, and then ultimately for Trump to take Pennsylvania by no small margin on election night. So I think that the Biden campaign is being very careful right now. They're sort of trying to make sure that they are not making the mistakes of the past. And like I said, a big part of that is making sure that they're getting turnout, not just from all voters, but especially from Black voters, Hispanic voters, Latino voters. Those are areas that they really want to make sure they're focusing on in the last days of the campaign.
So, Emily, briefly here at the end, where is his running mate, Kamala Harris?
So Kamala is in Pennsylvania today, along with her husband, Doug. They are also going to be going through the state. Kamala's been all over the map. She's been to Florida. She's been to Texas, really making sure to get out there and sort of get out the message in some of these states where Biden either has a very slight lead or is only behind Trump slightly in the polls.
Okay, Emily, thank you so very much. That's Emily Wilkins of Bloomberg Government. Emily will be part of our election coverage starting tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. In the meantime, coming up, Balance of Power continues on Bloomberg Radio. In our second hour, we're going to talk to pollster John Zogby about the state of his profession on the eve of the election. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio.